Two basketball teams trending in the wrong direction in Bloomington. Today, we're going to get bracketology updates for both the men's and women's basketball programs. On the men's side, we'll look at a flaw in the roster that is leading to struggles both closing games and closing this season. On the women's side, we'll look at a team that finally is going to have a chance at some rest and to regroup as their season is slowly starting to slip away as well.
You are Locked On Hoosiers, your daily podcast on the Indiana Hoosiers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, guys? It is Wednesday, February 23rd. This, as always, is Locked On Hoosiers, your daily one-stop shop for everything IU athletics, whether it's news, analysis, previews, recaps, all the fun stuff in between. I'm your host, as always, Jacob Rude. Want to thank you guys for making Locked On Hoosiers your first listen every day. Just a reminder, we're free and available on all platforms, including YouTube, where we premiere the episodes every morning at 7 a.m. As I said, we have both a men's and women's basketball team trending in the wrong direction. We're going to talk about both teams today. Look at one of the big flaws in this men's basketball roster. A couple people have started to point out that is worth diving into a little bit more. On the women's side, it's not a lot of their own doing that has led to some of their struggles. It's a very tired team trying to hold on to a top 4 seed in the NCAA Tournament and a chance to host some tournament games. It was a season that looked like it could be destined for a Big Ten title, and now it's a team that is kind of having to hang on to keep a special season together a bit. We're also, as I said, going to talk on some bracketology as well, get some updates on those. Before we do all of that, want to remind you guys to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening to it at. You can follow us on Twitter at LO_Hoosiers. We're going to do a Spaces at halftime of the IU Maryland game. I promise, Scouts Honor this time. We will do that to get you guys some thoughts on the first half of that game, get everybody's thoughts on the game. So we will be doing that for the IU Maryland game. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at LO_Hoosiers. All right, let's dive into this one. I saw some interesting points made about this IU men's basketball team roster. There's a lot of flaws with this team. We've pointed them out a little bit. A lot of square pegs and round holes, which is to be expected. Mike Woodson came in, did the best he could, brought in a bunch of transfer players that are talented, no doubt, but a lot of them may be miscast in roles. And as a result, the team as a whole is starting to struggle. I mean, they struggled for much of the season, but those struggles have become more pronounced as the season is coming to its end. One of the biggest ones I don't need to really dive in on at all. There's just not enough shooting. We've talked about it. It's readily apparent when you watch games. Defenses just aren't worried about the Hoosiers outside shooting. Really, they only have one reliable shooter in Parker Stewart, and everyone else is pretty high variance or just not a good shooter at all. So if you're paying attention to Parker Stewart, you can kind of live and die with anybody else making three-pointers, and that's just not sustainable in modern college basketball. More importantly than that, though, something this team really, really lacks is just a go-to scorer on the perimeter. Obviously, you have someone like Trace Jackson-Davis, who one of the best forwards in the country, one of the best players in the country, probably still going to be an All-American. His season has kind of tailed off a little bit down the stretch here, but probably still going to be an All-American. But you can see how teams can kind of scheme him out of the game. You just pack the paint. Part of it is roster construction and not really his fault, but you can pack the paint, make sure all 5 guys are aware when he gets the ball, double, triple team him, and get the ball out of his hands. When you have somebody that you can go to on the perimeter, you can just give the ball to him at the top of the key, tell him to go get a bucket, maybe do a little screen and roll action. That you can't scheme somebody out of the game like that. And if you do, you're trapping way, way, way farther away from the basket, and you're leaving the rest of your defense compromised. There's a difference between doubling a perimeter player at the 3-point line versus doubling a post player 10, 12 feet from the hoop. You can look at recent IU games for examples of this. Malachi Branham for Ohio State, you saw just it. I'm not even talking necessarily just its elite level player. Malachi Branham is a very good player, and just having that type of guy who can get to a spot and make a shot, IU doesn't have anybody like that on the roster. Johnny Davis, we saw, he's one of the best players in the country as well, but that's maybe the top end example of just a player you can give the ball and he can get a bucket. You saw it with Jaden Ivey, another kind of high level example in that Purdue game in Assembly Hall. He drugged Purdue back into that game by just getting to the rim, getting to his spot, whatever shot he wanted, it felt like he could get. You don't even have to look. I mean, Grace Berger with the women's basketball team is another example of that. She is as good of a mid-range scorer as there is, and how many times this season has she knocked down some huge shots? I think back to that Purdue game on the road where she hit some enormous shots in that comeback, and they just gave her the ball and trusted what she could do. When you have a player like that, for one, if you can complement him with Trace Jackson Davis, it takes a lot of pressure off of him because, as I said, teams can't really afford to scheme. They just simply can't scheme a perimeter player like that out of the game without really compromising other parts of their defense. And that overall is just kind of an indicative of a problem with this roster is lacking guys who can take pressure off of Trace Jackson Davis, but it's just harder to stop a guy that can get to the bucket like that. I mean, you can spread the floor out, you can go one-on-one, and you're left with hoping that your best defender is better than the best offensive player, whoever that may be. And we've seen that as good as this IU team has been, guys like Johnny Davis, guys like Malachi Branham, good offense beats good defense 9 times out of 10, I would say. And the Hoosiers have seen that all season long. It just in general, this IU offense lacks scores. You saw at the end of that Ohio State game, IU probably had the best possible offensive lineup they could put on the floor. When you're just talking sheer best offensive players, I think I might have mentioned this lineup before, but you have to have a point guard out there. So Xavier Johnson. If you're looking at 2 wing players that are your best kind of offensive threats, it's definitely Parker Stewart and probably Tamar Bates. Maybe against Ohio State, you could make a case for Miller Kopp, but then you're always going to have Trace and Race out there. That was about as good as it gets for IU offensively, and they still couldn't score the ball late. So I don't want to point fingers, or that isn't what this is about, but it's just kind of showing what this team lacks. I know there's been more and more criticism just levied all throughout on Mike Woodson, on the players, on all types of people. I think this roster is really just flawed, and it's still a good roster, and you can still win games. They've won a lot of games with this roster, but a lot of those flaws come out late in close games when it's defenses tighten up and lock down, and it's a lot harder to get a basket. IU doesn't have anybody not named Trace Jackson Davis that they can turn to for that. And defenses have time and time again schemed Trace out of the game late by just not allowing him to catch the ball or attempt to score with double teams. And the nature of the player he is, we've talked about before, he's not going to force it into a double team. It's hard to criticize someone for that. As much as you might want Trace to do that, that's just not the player he is. He's going to find the open guy. So that flaw has shown itself maybe most loudly at the end of games and considering the amount of close games the Hoosiers have had in this 5-game losing streak. It's been more and more apparent. Now, is that player on the roster coming? I I think Tamar Bates can be that kind of guy. There's a lot of potential there, and I can see why he was a 5-star recruit. He struggled this season. I think he's trending upward while while the rest of the team may be trending downward. I've thought he's played better and better of late. I think that potential is there for him maybe next year or the following season, depending on kind of what trajectory he's on. Jalen Hood Shafino seems like he could be that type of guy next season. 6'5", kind of point guard. That's the size of a guy that can create his own shot and have a kind of height advantage at the point guard position. Sounds like he's a guy that can get to the rim, but also have a really strong pull-up mid-range game. Can find guys. He seems like the type of guy that you could give the ball to late in those situations. He's still going to be a freshman, so how much you trust that we'll see, but seems like he's that type of guy. Maybe the Hoosiers bring in a transfer as well that can be that type of guy. We don't know what the transfer portal is going to look like. The Hoosiers leaned pretty heavily into it this past offseason. We'll see who comes and goes and how that shakes out. It's pretty impossible to predict that, but right now, outside of Tamar Bates, nobody on this current roster I can really see being that type of person. Jalen Hood Shafino's coming in, so maybe you can consider that. So that to me is one of the biggest reasons the Hoosiers struggle late in games, is that they just simply don't have a go-to guy on the perimeter that they can, when they need a bucket, they can have that person get one. And the result is a team that is sliding rapidly out of the NCAA tournament. We're going to take a look at latest ESPN Inside the Hall Andy Bottoms, some of those projections, see where the Hoosiers fall on that, look at some bubble teams you need to be cheering against in the coming week. Before all that, this is typically about the time of year I give up on my New Year's resolutions. Not this year, though. I'm sticking with Built Bar. It almost feels like it's not really a resolution because I enjoy eating them. All Built Bars are covered in 100% real chocolate. That to me is what makes them taste like they aren't a protein bar, not one of those waxy, chewy, hard to swallow protein bars. Built Bars are full of flavor. There's so many different flavors to choose from. We talk about it all the time. Mint brownie, coconut almond. Their special this month is white chocolate cookies and cream. They're always updating with new flavors. Most importantly, though, they're low calorie, high protein. You can replace whatever your favorite candy bar is with these. They're better for you. Most Built Bars contain 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, 4 net carbs, 17 grams of protein. They're good for you. They taste good. It almost feels too good to be true. I promise it is not. At Built Bar, they're all about taste. They make it taste delicious first, then they figure out how to make it healthy. And I don't know how, but they pull it off every time. So go to Built.com, use promo code LOCKED15, get 15% off your order. That's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Thanks for making Locked On Hoosiers your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you guys get your favorite podcasts. Let's look at some men's college basketball bracketology. A couple different places updated their brackets on Tuesday. Joe Lunardi over at ESPN. We mentioned prior to Tuesday, his latest bracketology did not have Indiana either in the last 4 in or last 4 byes. You lose to Ohio State and you get put into the last 4 in. This is just kind of indicative of a team trending rapidly in the wrong direction. IU is the third to last team in, if I'm reading this right. I'm not sure top down which order it goes in, but IU firmly on that bubble, joined by Michigan, Memphis, and San Diego State. If you want some good news, San Diego State lost to Boise State on Tuesday, so a small win there for the Hoosiers. Pretty much everywhere seems like San Diego State is right there on the bubble with the Hoosiers. The first 4 out, you're looking at SMU, BYU, Oklahoma, another team that is rapidly trending in the wrong direction. As it stands, not that it feels like it really matters. Indiana would be in the play-in game against San Diego State as a 12 seed, and then they would play UConn if they win that game as the 5 seed. So playing games are fun, not when your team is in them. A lot more fun as a neutral fan. If you want to look over at Andy Bottoms at Inside the Hall, another really accurate predictor, hopefully he's wrong on this one because he has IU in the first 5 out. This team, the struggles on the road are really killing this team. 2-7 with a sub 300 non-conference schedule. We talked about that was a necessity with a first-year coach, but it's going to hurt them when it comes to that selection Sunday. Now, if there's bubble teams you want to be rooting against, there's a handful of familiar names that you can be rooting against in the coming days. One of them we talked about the other day, Michigan. Joe Lunardi has them right there with Indiana on the last 4 in. Andy Bottoms also has them in the last 4 in. For those that missed it, I'm not sure how. The Juwan Howard suspended for the rest of the season. That team seems to be in a little bit of flux. They have a rather tough finish to their schedule, though they have 4 straight home games, a positive. They're coming against Rutgers, Illinois, Michigan State, Iowa, and then close on the road at Ohio State. That is 4 really tough games. Rutgers is the easiest of those. Rutgers is really surging. Pay attention to that as IU fans. But Rutgers is really surging, and if that's your easiest game, that is going to be a tough finish to the season. Not really sure what way that program is going to go, but for IU fans, you should hope that they start imploding. Obviously, that Michigan-Rutgers game is kind of a win-win for the Hoosiers because Rutgers is another team that's going to be right there on the bubble. They are in the last 4 in for Andy Bottoms. They're not in the last 4 in or next 4 in on Joe Lunardi, but IU wasn't before their loss to Ohio State. So that can all change rapidly. Rutgers is a 10 seed right now. Those are 2 teams the Hoosiers need to be rooting against. Rutgers' schedule is a little bit easier. They will face Wisconsin. Obviously, the Hoosiers, that IU Rutgers game is going to be absolutely massive for IU. This is after going to Michigan. They will host Wisconsin. They will go to Assembly Hall. Then they will host Penn State. If there's every game IU has the rest of the way is must win. That Rutgers game is absolute must win. That game is going to need as much fan support as possible. That is going to be a really, really big game for IU to knock off another potential bubble team. North Carolina, another team. There's a lot of mid-majors on the bubble, and that's kind of tricky to try to pay attention to. We mentioned BYU, SMU, San Diego State, they lost. San Francisco, Creighton, a lot of those are hard to really monitor. I mean, their conferences are so top-heavy typically that it's hard to really watch game to game how much that matters. North Carolina is the opposite. They, too, have a pretty tough close to the season. They will go to NC State, who is not good this season, but that is a rival for whatever that's worth on the road. They will then host Syracuse. IU fans are familiar with, and playing that 2-3 zone is always frustrating. And then they will close the season at Duke. So swallow big and cheer for Duke is what IU fans are going to have to do to some degree to root against North Carolina on the bubble. And again, I hate bubble watch, but this is what it's going to take for the Hoosiers. Memphis, another team that they're trending a little bit upward. They had won 6 straight. They lost to SMU on Sunday. They have a kind of a weird profile, but again, another team that kind of plays in a lower level conference. Florida was another one that you can be rooting against in a major conference. They will. They have. I mean, I was going to say they've struggled this season. Everybody on the bubble has struggled to some degree this season. They lost on Tuesday though to Arkansas, so that is a positive. They will play Tom Crean's Georgia in what is probably going to be one of Tom Crean's final games. For those who haven't paid attention, that Georgia team is struggling right now. So if hopefully Tom Crean does a solid for the Hoosiers, beats Florida, then they have Vanderbilt and Kentucky to round out the season. It's going to be a really tough close to their season. Joe Lenardi has them as the next 4 out, and Andy Bottoms has them in the first 5 out. So we'll kind of try to keep you updated on this as much as it matters, because the Hoosiers have to start winning games regardless. Like, we can watch the bubble as much as we want, but if IU keeps losing, there's going to be no bubble to worry about. And that starts on Thursday. They will take on Maryland. We will preview that game tomorrow. Let's look at the women's basketball team and their own bracketology and how they can kind of right the ship a little bit as well. Before that, football season might be over, but basketball is in full steam with pro and college hoops. For all the latest odds, totals, player performance props, to where the next fired head coach is going to land, betonline.net is the number one spot for all your sports betting needs. BetOnline remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. It's not just basketball. BetOnline.net is your source for hockey, boxing, and UFC odds as well. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about trends and actions. BetOnline, where the game starts. As always, women's basketball bracketology is far, far, far more scarce. We really can only regularly reference ESPN's Charlie Cream, who also updated his bracket on Tuesday. And the Hoosiers are taking a hit. Losers of 3 of their last 4 back-to-back games. IU is all the way down to a 4 seed. That is as low as they've been this season. If you're a top 4 seed in your region, you will host the first 2 rounds of games. So in that sense, Hoosiers are still in the driver's seat, I guess, for hosting those games. But IU, as the men's team is trending in the wrong direction. That Maryland game, we always knew was going to be a big game. But if for nothing else, then for the Hoosiers to right the ship, that is a really big game on Friday coming up. Indiana really needs to get out of the rut they're in. Part of that is self-imposed. Their offense has gone really cold at times, and that was the case against Iowa late on Monday and early in the game on Saturday. Part of it as well is just the nature of what this schedule has ended up being, and we talked about that when they had their 2-week COVID pause, that this middle of February was going to be absolutely brutal, and it was. They played 3 games in 5 days, 5 games in 10 days, and 7 games in 17 days, wrapping up on Monday against Iowa. That's without making up 1 game as well. They're going to finish 1 game short in the Big Ten season. So we expected this. It doesn't make it any easier to get or to go through. So what can this team do to kind of regroup? I mean, one, just getting 3 days off is a rarity. It's the first time they're going to have 3 days off between games since before this COVID pause in the middle of January. So just having time to kind of decompress and relax for a second before getting back up, preparing for this Maryland game is going to be big. And I'm sure mentally that's almost as kind of relaxing as all the physical benefits of having an extra day or 2 of rest. Getting Mackenzie Holmes back has been a positive in the long run. In the short run, that was a couple brutal games to try to work her back in, not have her be 100% against Sonano and Iowa. That's one of the better post players in the country, one of the more physical ones. And I mean, it's not her fault. And ultimately, you want Mackenzie Holmes back as quick as possible, but she didn't look herself for really either of those games. She showed a lot more flashes in that game Monday with some mid-range jumpers that Terry Morin talked about. Just in general, scoring around the basket. She had double figures scoring. She looked more like herself. Getting her multiple days to continue rehabbing, continue working that rust off is going to be really helpful as well. In general, it's going to be a much needed kind of break here for the Hoosiers. They don't play until Friday. They play Maryland, and then they have a couple more days off before the Big Ten tournament. We talked about needing to get that double bye, be a top 4 seed. That requires a win against Maryland for that to even be a conversation. And if you get that double bye, it means you're a top 4 seed, and it's one less game you have to play in the Big Ten tournament. I mean, there's all kinds of benefits of having that double bye. Right now, the Hoosiers are one of 5 or 4 teams with 4 losses, but as we mentioned in Monday's episode, the losses don't matter because the Hoosiers have one less game played. So while they all have 4 losses, Ohio State, Maryland, and Iowa all have a 75% win percentage, and IU's is at 73. So that's kind of a tiebreaker that doesn't go in the Hoosiers' favor. So you beat Maryland, you have fewer losses, and at the end of the day, that'll give you a better win percentage at the end of the season. So you beat Maryland and you get a top 4 seed, and that's going to be the focus right now for the Hoosiers before they go to the Big Ten tournament. If they're a top 4 seed, they won't play until Friday of next week. If I remember correctly, if they're not a top 4 seed, if they're the 5 seed, then you're looking at a Thursday start, which is the case. If they're the 5 seed, they will play roughly maybe 2 o'clock, 1:30, 2 o'clock on that Thursday. If you're the 4 seed, you don't play until about the same time on Friday. So an extra day's rest for this team that, for all the reasons we just talked about, is sorely needed and something that they would love. So that all starts, though, by winning on the road against Maryland, a team Hoosiers needed overtime to beat at home. That's 2 teams in very different spots. Maryland has kind of regrouped from a swoon in the middle of the season, and the Hoosiers they've certainly played better, and they certainly have looked better this season than they do right now. We'll preview that game a little more in depth on Friday's episode, but that's where the Hoosiers women's basketball team is right now. Ultimately, they're going to be in the tournament, but it does feel a little bit like a missed opportunity through no fault of their own. It's just kind of one of those things that happens with COVID in 2022, 2021, in last couple seasons. It was out of their control getting COVID or having that COVID outbreak, and that, among other things, has really, really stacked the deck against them to close this season. We'll keep monitoring them as well. We'll also preview IU's game against Maryland in tomorrow's episode. Thanks again for making Locked On Hoosiers your first listen every day. We'll be back tomorrow with that preview. Now make your second listen the Locked On NFL Draft podcast, hosted by Ryan Tracy and former NFL cornerback Eric Crocker. They bring the NFL Draft to life every day with insight and analysis on college football prospects and NFL front offices. It's free and available wherever you get podcasts. Appreciate all the love. I know I say it all the time. I mean it all the time. And all the ratings, the feedback that you guys continue to give us. Follow us on Twitter for that halftime spaces on Thursday. Subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Leave a rating and review. Most importantly, though, guys, have a tremendous